This is a made-up narrative inspired on actual case patterns I've researched. Leave a comment with your location. I adore how these stories bring people together from all walks of life. Few have stuck in my mind over the years of studying obscure instances from America's past. Similar to what transpired in the fall of 1897 at Briar Creek. The Appalachian foothills in eastern Kentucky, where the valley is located, provide natural pathways between communities. Prestonburg, the closest town of any size at the time, was reached by a muddy road that became impassable when it rained a lot. Please note that you are now listening to this story on the Fear Behind You channel. Please be advised that this video has been duplicated and uploaded without my permission if you are hearing it from any other channel. If so, I respectfully request that you report it. We appreciate your support of original material. The actual Briar Creek was merely a collection of farms and a general shop. They believed it to be the type of location where everyone knew each other's business. What attracted? One line from an 1898 county clerk's ledger led me to this case. A remark regarding a house on the creek being declared abandoned and its contents put up for auction was buried among marriage licenses and property transactions. Other than the scrawled margin remark that only stated, "No claims, no explanation provided," nothing out of the ordinary. For example, when I compared this to regional newspapers from the time period, I discovered that when regular notices should have appeared, there was simply quiet. That lack of said more than any headline could. Vesper Grimshaw, a woman who came to the region sometime in early 1895, owned the property in question. Let me clarify what the records truly reveal. She used cash to buy 43 acres along the western bend of the stream, which was unusual but not unheard of. Although I couldn't find any marital records to support this, the deed describes her as a widow from Virginia. Although the name Grimshaw is found in several Virginia counties, none of the family trees I looked at relate neatly to a person who fits her description. She resided alone in a 2-story frame house constructed by the property's previous owner, a farmer named Lysander Hale, who passed away from pneumonia the previous winter, according to the 1896 agricultural census. She claimed no occupation, grew no crops, and had no cattle, according to the census taker. The house and the property it was situated on were her sole stated assets. This was significant for a rural community where every able-bodied person contributed to survival. She was remembered, but their recollections were annoyingly hazy. A graduate student studying folklore at the University of Kentucky conducted interviews with a number of Valley elders in 1952 for a thesis on oral traditions in Appalachia. 3 of them made reference to the Grimshaw house, but only in passing and always with the cautious tone one uses when talking about something one would prefer to forget. Parthena Comes, one of the informants, stated simply, "We were instructed not to pass by there after dark, not for any particular reason, just that it wasn't appropriate." She shifted the topic when questioned about specifics. This response's constancy is what makes it intriguing. This intentional ambiguity is present in every reference to Vesper Grimshaw in extant records or recollections. Like a bruise that everyone knows not to touch, she was there in the community's consciousness. According to the county tax records, she always made her annual payments on time. She made monthly supply purchases, according to Morrison's General Mercantile Shop ledger. The same things every time: writing paper, lamp oil, wheat, and salt. Nothing out of the ordinary, nothing strange. However, this is when the case takes a truly frightening turn. Morrison's store was visited by Dr. Garrick Matz, a traveling physician, in July 1897. He was traveling through the mountain valleys, providing services to isolated communities that seldom received enough medical attention. In her own journal, Temperance, Morrison's daughter who assisted with bookkeeping, wrote that the doctor explicitly inquired as to if anyone in the region needed his assistance. She stated that a number of people expressed interest, but Morrison himself cut them off when they mentioned the widow's home, saying that Mrs. Grimshaw didn't need to be bothered. 3 days later, Dr. Mathers left the area. An entry from that visit appears in his personal journal, which is kept in a medical repository in Lexington. The majority of it deals with commonplace instances, small illnesses, and the typical struggles of rural living. However, there's a passage near the conclusion that I've probably read a dozen times. It was somewhat strange how the storekeeper responded when I asked about a certain property. He was very adamant that I had misinterpreted the fact that the residence in question was very well run. I hadn't, however, inquired about management. I had only inquired as to whether a wellness check would be beneficial for the occupant. He seemed to have a shared understanding that I was unaware of, based on how quickly he changed the subject. Mountain communities frequently defend their own in ways that are hard for outsiders to understand. Mathers are never. Went back to Briar Creek. I'm not sure if this was a result of circumstance or choice. I can assure you that something changed in the valley between July and October of 1897. Only when you know to look for it can you see the subtle shift in the records. The Prestonburg Courier, a weekly publication that served a number of neighboring counties, provides the first specific clue. There is a tiny note in the October 14th publication. Unusual activity at the Western Bend has been reported by Briar Creek residents. Sheriff of the county has been informed. That's the whole thing. No further explanation or follow-up in later editions. Over the next 6 months, I looked over every issue. Nothing. In 1897, what would be considered uncommon activity in a farming valley. Newspapers of the time were extremely open about violence, accidents, and other incidents, as I have researched enough of these cases to know. Someone would have spoken out if they had been harmed. They would have made specifics if there had been property damage. The clue lies in the vagueness itself. Records of the sheriff from Pike County, which was in charge of that area of the valley, demonstrate that on October 16th, Deputy Marshal Thaddeus Carver sent out a request to look into the report. His formal notation is incredibly succinct. When I visited the Briar Creek property, everything was in order and no additional action was needed. A second document, however, was discovered during a 1963 family estate sale. It was a private letter that Carver wrote to his brother in Ohio. He gives a distinct account of the visit in it. I am unable to express. He wrote about the mood of that house. Mrs. Grimshaw was quite friendly when she answered the door. She was genuinely perplexed by the reports and provided no explanation. Nothing caught my eye when I looked at the properties outside. However, I was asked the same question by everyone I met on the trip, both before and after, if I had been inside. They were clearly relieved when I told them no and simply talked to her on the porch. No one would say exactly what they were afraid I may discover. I felt like I had taken part when I left. In an unwritten contract, albeit I'm still unable to identify it. Vesper Grimshaw vanished less than 2 weeks later. In other words, she stopped being watched. Once more, the distinction is important. A disappearance indicates that someone became aware of her absence and alerted authorities. In reality, the situation was more subtle. In the valley, life went on. The seasons shifted. No one saw the widow again, but the house stood and smoke might occasionally be seen coming from its chimney. Legally, the land was hers until April 1898, when the abandonment process was started by the county clerk. Although no petition remains to verify who explicitly made the request or why, the record implies that this was done at the community's request. On April 28th, the auction notification was delivered via courier. In order to pay taxes, the county was to get the earnings from the sale of the house and its belongings. About 30 individuals showed up for the auction, based on what I can piece together. This is based on a letter that the county received from the auctioneer. Clerk talking on how the purchased goods will be distributed. What they discovered within is amazing. The house was kept up and completely furnished. The pantry shelves were filled with preserved items. Beside the hearth, firewood was neatly placed. The wardrobe was filled with clothes. The bed was ready, a teacup half full of liquid that had long since evaporated, leaving a black ring rested on the kitchen table. A fountain pen and numerous handwritten sheets of paper were placed next to it. These things are particularly mentioned in the auctioneer's letter, since they caused an issue. Selling someone's private writings didn't feel right, but he had no one to give them back to. He eventually packaged them with other documents, and Sinclair Webb, a local lawyer with a reputation for gathering odd records, bought them. The Kentucky Historical Society has kept Webb's personal journals. I read them for 3 days. He wrote about reviewing the Grimshaw House documents in November of 1898. The majority were ordinary correspondence. On real estate, personal thoughts about farming and the weather, and other topics that someone living alone could write to keep things normal. However, on October 12, 1897, a letter was sent to no one. Parts of it were transcribed into Webb's journal. They think I don't comprehend their actions. How carefully they've constructed the boundaries of permissible interaction, how they've turned proximity into isolation without ever saying it out loud, the text said. This isn't cruelty in the traditional sense. Instead, I've become a tale people tell themselves about generosity and kindness, making sure that story never required them to enter my home or actually witness how I spent my days. It might even be a form of kindness. When I arrived, I wanted to be left alone, and they have provided me just that. It appears that they understood my request because they fulfilled it so fully and with such consistent dedication from every home in the valley. Not completely express, not even to myself. The letter ends there, Tome. She didn't write anything more she had planned to write. Toward the conclusion, Webb noticed that the handwriting degraded, the letters losing control, but he was unable to tell if this was due to emotion or just plain exhaustion. What, then, did Vesper Grimshaw really do? I don't know, to put it simply. No one in Briar Creek did either, or if they did, it was never documented in any of the records I could locate. However, I want to take you for a walk between what we can prove and what is still up in the air, as this case exists on the boundary between the two. Let's begin with what we already know. In 1895, a woman going by the name Vesper Grimshaw bought land in a remote valley. She spent about 2.5 years living there. She bought supplies, paid taxes, kept up with property maintenance, and had no recorded disputes with her neighbors throughout that time. According to reports, she was reserved, quiet, and gave no clear explanation. For worry. The community's perception of her or her circumstances then shifted in October 1897. She was essentially gone in a matter of weeks, and her property was being liquidated in a matter of months. Now, the most straightforward explanation is that she just didn't bother to notify anyone or settle her property matters and went voluntarily, possibly to return to family somewhere else. This occurs, we sometimes forget how mobile people were in the 890s. However, why did she leave if this was a voluntary departure? Everything in the rear. Why was the house kept up as if she might come back at any time? Another theory is that she became debilitated due to sickness, died in the house, and had her body removed by unidentified persons. This would explain why neighbors, if they had found her dead and dealt with it informally to avoid bureaucratic hassles, appeared unwilling to divulge information. Although the time frame doesn't entirely support this, mountain communities frequently handled such issues internally. If she passed away in the middle of October, who? Was the fire being maintained from which witnesses claimed to have seen smoke throughout the winter? A third interpretation is possible, but it necessitates knowledge of how rural communities operated during that era. In a place where such arrangements were unusual enough to draw attention, Vesper Grimshaw either claimed to be a widow or lived alone. Her financial autonomy, her lack of obvious sources of support, and her willful seclusion would have all led to quiet rumors, not necessarily negative ones, but tenacious. Instead of pushing her away, what if the community made it clear that she was being watched, evaluated, and maintained at a safe distance? What if she had been acknowledging in that letter to no one a social exile so subtle and comprehensive that no one had ever been overtly hostile? Given that, her disappearance may have been more of a psychological retreat than a physical one so total that she stopped taking part in the obvious, the world. The house itself provides an odd form of witness. The foundation stones are still visible, organized in a rectangle close to the creek bend, when I visited the location in the early months of this investigation, expecting to see ruins or maybe no trace at all. The area has mostly been overtaken by local vegetation, but the contour is still visible if you know where to look. According to a historical society member, up until the 1940s, tourists occasionally reported feeling anxious as they passed the location, but nobody could explain why. I've learnt to be aware of these inherited responses, the way that communities transmit fatigue from one generation to the next without always recognizing the initial cause. It is a type of cultural memory that is flawed and frequently skewed, but not wholly unfounded. The communal quiet around this issue is what disturbs me the most and has kept me coming back to it over the years. When someone declines to talk about something, it's reasonable. 10 or 100 individuals, each separately determining that some details are better left unconsidered. Coordination is necessary for that. It implies that the community reached an unwritten consensus in response to whatever occurred in or around that house in October of 1897, even if it was unconscious. We will not recognize this. We will not look into it, and we will not have a vivid memory of it. During his brief visit, Dr. Matherther sensed it. When folks expressed relief, Deputy Carver sensed it, that he hadn't gone inside. It was evident to the auctioneer that individuals were being cautious about inquiring about what they had discovered within. Perhaps the finest person to understand it was Vesper Grimshaw, who realized that she had turned into a type of accepted absence, a presence that everyone accepted by resolutely averting their eyes. In all of this, there is a philosophical question that transcends the particulars of this instance. How much of a person's life is dependent on being seen by others? Does someone effectively cease to exist in any meaningful social sense if a community chooses to stop perceiving them, whether on purpose or not? And if that's the case, Vesper Grimshaw's disappearance may not be so much a mystery as it is an example of how completely a person can be forgotten by a communal decision to forget them. Webb picked up the documents from the house, as I mentioned before. According to his notebooks, he preserved them for a number of years, periodically going over them in search of a satisfactory explanation. He gave his complete collection of records to the County Historical Society in 1902, stating that he had only discovered more questions rather than answers in the Grimshaw files. The donation was received and catalogued according to the Society's records. However, those particular articles were absent from the repository when researchers searched for them in 1968. The catalog listing for them had been purposefully struck through with a remark stating just removed, so it was not misplaced. March 19. 03, upon request. Who made the request? It's unclear from the records, but less than 5 years after Vesper Grimshaw vanished, someone had strong enough feelings about those documents to make sure they were taken off the public record. Thus, after reading them, Someone else, someone with power or influence, decided that the community would be better off without access to whatever they contained. I've looked for further evidence of her. Church registries, death records, and census information from Virginia prior to her arrival in Kentucky. Each and every. The search ends in the same manner, with a name that shows momentarily before disappearing. I couldn't find a husband if Grimshaw was her married name. I couldn't find the original identity if it was a pseudonym. For the residents of Briar Creek, she is still exactly who she was. A figure characterized by silence, by what was left unsaid, by what no one really cared to look too closely at. The last recorded reference I could find dates back to 1961. An article about Eastern Kentucky's local tales and ghost stories was published in a regional magazine. In the center, buried, is a passage that discusses Briar Creek. The widow's dwelling in our mice lease is still remembered by the elderly. It reads, "Few people can agree on what exactly made it noteworthy, but most claim it was nothing more than a typical house that eventually fell into ruin and was demolished. However, there's a lingering feeling that something once occurred there that the community decided not to talk about. When pressed, all they will say is that it's better to leave some stories alone, and that it doesn't benefit anyone to pick at old scars. Moreover, then they shift the topic. Anyone who was an adult in 1897 would have passed on by 1961. The interviewees were sharing first-hand recollections, tales that their elders had alluded to but never completely described. However, the hesitancy still exists even at that distance. Everyone who was aware of the initial facts has been outlived by the avoidance habit. I imagine what those last few weeks must have been like for Vesper Grimshaw, residing in a home that was well known, but nobody would. Visit, observing smoke coming from nearby chimneys, and realizing that assistance would never arrive, even though those families were nearby enough to provide assistance if necessary. Not because she was hostile, but rather due to a more subtle collective consensus that she was better controlled from a distance. The loneliness of being surrounded by individuals who have consented to obscure your vision. I also consider the psychological toll of upholding that agreement on the community as a whole. Everyone who passed her property and purposefully didn't, quit. Every interaction that would have included her name was skillfully changed to something else, maintaining a collective forgetting by persistent, low-level effort. Such social coordination is not something that just happens. It takes inspiration and a mutual understanding that giving her full recognition would open a door that is better left unopened. What was behind that door? I have formulated theories, the majority of which I am unable to validate. Perhaps she was seen as a threat by the community, a role model for women. Independents that put their conception of appropriate social order to the test. Perhaps others were wary because of repeated, unsubstantiated rumors about her past. Perhaps she just wanted to be left alone, and they took her words so literally that it turned into an act of desertion. Or perhaps, and this is the theory that keeps me up at night, nothing noteworthy actually occurred. Perhaps Vesper Grimshaw was just what she seemed to be, a widow looking for solace in a far-off valley. Additionally, perhaps the community's reaction was only the human predisposition to invent mystery where there is merely ordinary melancholy. Perhaps the entire structure of significance has been built around a woman who lived a tranquil life and passed away without any drama. The quiet that envelops her is just the same as the quiet that envelops innumerable other lives that have been forgotten. However, I don't think that's true. I've studied too many human behavior patterns and read too many cases. There is a distinction between being forgotten, both because you were unremarkable and because remembering would necessitate admitting something unpleasant. The cautious ambiguity of testimony, the intentional striking of records, and the inherited uneasiness that lasted for generations. Instead of passive neglect, These suggest intentional repression. Whatever transpired in the Briar Creek house in October 1897, it was important enough that several people over several decades made deliberate decisions to hide the specifics. They departed with an outline, a shadow of what happened, but the substance was taken away. And in doing so, they produced precisely the kind of riddle that can never be solved because those who thought they had solid reasons purposefully destroyed the answer. I've given the question of whether I have the authority to continue looking into this matter a lot of thought. Who am I to insist on bringing something back into the open when a community has decided to leave it unexplored? These are not simple questions. Responses. This conflict between honoring historical privacy and maintaining the significance of the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it may be, is a constant in historical research. I can tell you this for sure. There was Vesper Grimshaw. She kept up a household, paid taxes, and bought real estate. She interacted with genuine individuals who had real reactions to her presence, and she lived in a specific location at a certain time. After she left, the area she had occupied was meticulously cleared of any evidence that could help explain why or where she had disappeared. The house was sold. The documents were taken out of the archives. They let the recollections dissolve into nebulous discomfort. She turned into a story with no conclusion, which may be the most unnerving form of story there is, because it implies that the true answer is somewhere in documents I haven't located, or testimonials that have never been recorded. Someone was aware of what transpired. Perhaps a few people were aware. They just choose not to share. And they made such a wise decision that a century and a quarter later, we were left with shards, ramifications, and the specter of a story that, to those who lived it, made perfect sense. Along Briar Creek, the foundation stones remain intact. You can practically picture how the house must have seemed if you go there early in the morning when the mist is rising off the sea. The white paint on 2 stories is deteriorating in the humid mountain environment. Smoke rising from the chimney, a lone figure glimpsed through the windows every now and then, almost but not quite since. In actuality, imagination needs some basis, and the facts have been carefully eliminated. Instead, we have the form of an absence that has been meticulously preserved over many generations. And maybe that's the true tale here. What happened to the truth about Vesper Grimshaw, not to her? How a group of people determined that some knowledge was best left buried without seeming to debate it. How they carried out that choice so well that it outlived them, survived them, and became a part of the actual landscape. An anthropologist called Dr. Helena Marsh spent a summer in the valley collecting interviews in 1968. The last time anyone made a serious attempt to investigate this subject prior to my own attempts. One particularly telling discussion appeared in her fieldwork notebooks, which I acquired from her estate following her death in 1969. She had asked an old woman whether she had any recollections of the widow's home. Before answering, the woman had been silent for a few seconds. According to my granny, several things are kept secret for good reason, not always to keep the living safe, but to keep the tale safe. You can't unknow how something ends once you know it. Additionally, there are instances when ignorance is preferable to knowledge. Dr. Marsh urged her to provide more details, but the woman refused. This was a recurring theme in her interviews, according to her notes, as if they had reached an invisible barrier they had been taught not to cross. People would approach the edge of revelation and then turn back. Cross. Even those born decades after the events instinctively continued the training because it had been so effective. I find cases like this one fascinating for this reason. They show how communities defend themselves against potentially damaging internal knowledge rather than external threats. The residents of Briar Creek determined that whatever truth was at the core of the Vesper Grimshaw mystery was important enough to call for quarantine. They surrounded it with a wall of silence and kept it up so consistently that it became irreversible. And now, after all these years, we're left standing outside that wall, attempting to see what lies behind it through constantly shifting and closing cracks. Every line of inquiry ends in the same location, a deliberate absence, a void in the record that is too complete to be readily filled and too consistent to be accidental. I'll keep looking into this case. I haven't contacted descendant families. I haven't used all of the archives, physical evidence that could still be found, but I'm starting to suspect that I might be pursuing something that was intended to be impossible to capture. The creators of this mystery were skilled at what they did. They knew how to make something vanish not by eliminating all traces of it, but by eliminating the ties that would enable someone to piece together a cohesive story. They have left us with a collection of disparate facts, conflicting testimonies without, records that are highly contradictory and leave more questions than they address. And in the middle of it all was a woman named Vesper Grimshaw, who lived in a house by a creek for 2.5 years before disappearing so completely that we can't even be sure she was gone. She might have been exactly what she claimed, or she might have been something completely different. Now the house is gone, demolished or collapsed, engulfed by the valley that chose to forget what it saw. Those who were aware have passed away. The documents have been cleaned up. The oral traditions have been reduced to inherited discomfort and hazy warnings. The question itself is all that is left, frozen in time, unanswerable, and thus eternal. I sometimes question whether Vesper Grimshaw was aware of how completely she would be forgotten. If she hoped that someone would eventually piece together what happened and give her story the ending it deserved, or if she expected in those last few days or hours that her story would become this specific kind of void. If she was that, I've let her down, Hope. Everybody has. Because I still can't tell you what happened at the widow's house on Briar Creek in the fall of 1897, no matter how much I've learned or how many pieces I've gathered and organized. I can tell you that there was an incident. There is no denying that. The evidence is the silence itself. Testimony is the deliberate avoidance. A type of witness is the inherited uneasiness. People don't build this complex system of forgetting things. Nothing. They base it on something they fervently hope will be forgotten. Thus, the case is still open in the only manner possible for a case this old. Not in any formal sense, not with ongoing inquiry or hope for a solution, but in the enduring sense that the truth is waiting somewhere in some neglected corner of some archive. It has been waiting for more than 120 years. It has more time to wait. Despite the questions that are being asked, the creek continues to flow along its western bend, within its shadow. The valley is still gradually changing. The landscape is losing its history like so many dead leaves, with old farms turning into new subdivisions and dirt roads turning into pavement. Before long, there won't be any physical evidence that anyone by the name of Vesper Grimshaw ever stood there, looked out those windows, or wrote letters to no one sharing thoughts about loneliness and the strange feeling of being disregarded by people who say they don't mean you any harm. However, the mystery will continue to exist. Transmitted by individuals such as myself who find it in old records and are unable to let it go. We'll continue to look for the purposefully concealed explanation, hold out hope that the truth survived the purge somewhere, and most likely fail because those who concealed it were diligent, dedicated, and had the benefit of being close to the events. They were fully aware of what had to be hidden and how. The concealment itself was something they were unable to hide. That is the reason this case. Worth recording, disseminating, and preserving in some way. It illustrates a crucial point about how truth is lost, not because we might be able to solve it. Through active, coordinated, multi-generational suppression rather than merely forgetting. Motivation is necessary for such an endeavor. It necessitates consensus on what is best for the whole. Additionally, it necessitates a readiness to share personal knowledge in order to promote world peace. That exchange was made by Briar Creek residents. They exchanged. They kept up that transaction with amazing discipline. Knowing for not knowing, and certainty for quiet. They seemed to think it was worth the expense, whatever it was that they defended themselves against by forgetting Vesper Grimshaw. Who am I to claim that they were mistaken? I wasn't present. I didn't have to make the same decisions they did. I'm merely someone who arrived later, noticed the void they left behind, and felt compelled to attempt to fill it. However, there are some gaps that should not be filled. A few absences fulfill a purpose. The widow's house on Briar Creek may actually teach us that not all mysteries are worth solving. In the same way that the society learnt to leave Vesper Grimshaw alone until she was so completely alone that she ceased to exist in any form we can now retrieve, sometimes the most polite thing we can do is recognize the mystery exists and then leave it alone. There is a profoundly human quality to the want to solve problems, even when the individuals who came up with them are obviously desired that they go unsolved. We persuade ourselves that we are seeking the truth, upholding historical correctness, and paying respect to those who have been forgotten. However, there are moments when we simply cannot accept that certain doors were closed for reasons we will never completely comprehend. Our presumptions about our right to know are called into question by Vesper Grimshaw's story or lack thereof. It implies that forgetting can be just as legitimate a decision as remembering, and that communities have the right to collective amnesia. It also serves as a reminder that the past is more than just a storehouse of undiscovered information. Like any oral history, it is also a compilation of silences that were carefully selected, preserved, and transmitted. The home of the widow has vanished. The widow has passed away. Those who were aware of what transpired have vanished. The shape of their choice to forget is all that is left, preserved in the eraser's very fullness. And maybe that's sufficient. Maybe the story is in the absence itself, more beautiful than any reconstruction could. B. I consider all the lives that have gone through this valley, all the stories that have been told, forgotten, and never documented. While I stand at the location now and gaze at those foundation stones that are partially obscured by vegetation. Because no one believed they were worth keeping, the majority of them vanished. This one vanished because someone believed it was too significant to save and too hazardous to recall. That difference is important. Vesper Grimshaw is changed from being simply another forgettable individual into anything more important, a person who has been purposefully forgotten. Someone whose presence caused her community so much trouble that they actively worked to remove not only her from the area, but also any distinct recollection of what her presence signified. Was she a willful participant in her own erasure, a threat, a victim, or an outsider misinterpreted? The more I research, the more questions I have, and the answers continue to elude me. However, the questions are useful in and of themselves. They serve as a reminder that history is not only what took place, it's also what people intentionally sought to hide, what they decided to forget, and what they decided to document. An example of controlled forgetting is the case of Vesper Grimshaw. It demonstrates how a community may effectively make someone vanish through concerted quiet rather than violence. Additionally, it shows that even while these initiatives are frequently short-term effective, they leave behind effects that last for generations. The erasure's completeness itself raises questions. The silence's steadiness turns into proof of its own kind. Therefore, Even though I am unable to tell you what happened to Vesper Grimshaw in October of 1897, I can tell you that something important occurred, important enough to justify this complex construction of amnesia. I can tell you that a group of people decided to shield themselves from some information, and I can assure you that the mystery they constructed has outlived them all, in spite of their best efforts and more than a century of silence. The home of the widow on Briar Creek, a building constructed as much from absence as from wood and stone, today exists only in documents and dim memories. And whatever truth is buried there, that might be the most appropriate monument. There is a persistent question mark instead of a full story with a beginning, middle, and end. A gap that defies filling. A stillness that expresses itself more beautifully than any witness could. Years of looking into cases like this one have taught me this. Occasionally, the ignorance is a type of memory in and of itself. Sometimes, the most truthful response is to remain silent. Recognizing that we're on the precipice of something we'll never fully comprehend is sometimes the wisest course of action. Gazing into a shadow that was purposefully produced and meticulously preserved by those who, whether correctly or incorrectly, felt that some facts were best left hidden. Vesper Grimshaw desired seclusion. That desire was so fully fulfilled by the Briar Creek community that she became more isolated than anyone might have meant. And over a century later, she is still alone in the purest sense of the word, forgotten so completely that even the specifics of her forgetting have mostly vanished. The creek continues to flow. The valley shifts. Old stories are layered on top of new ones. However, somewhere beneath it all, concealed in the meticulous holes in the historical record, the purposeful exclusions from family histories, and the innate hesitancy to talk about particular subjects, the truth about what actually occurred at. That home from 1897 is still standing, not as something we can point to and say this is what happened, but rather as a presence defined by absence, a narrative conveyed by quiet, an enigma that was never truly alive and will not die, and perhaps that's sufficient. Perhaps the question's enduring nature, the uncertainty's resilience, and the fact that this case continues to elicit contemplation and research even in the absence of a conclusion serve a purpose of their own. It brings to mind us that there are depths in the past that we can perceive but never fully explore, that not everything can be known, and that certain mysteries are designed to remain unsolved. The widow's home is no longer there, but over a century of meticulous forgetting has left its shadow, and Vesper Grimshaw's story or lack thereof continues to have an odd kind of impact on how we think, as long as individuals like myself continue to look for answers in archival documents and fading testimony, as long as the question remains, despite the resolute absence of answers. Consider community, memory, and the unsettling ease with which a person can be removed from history while yet leaving enough evidence of their existence.